It was the spring of 2016 when I made the stupid decision to camp alone in an old graveyard just outside Newcastle. I was 28 at the time, working odd construction jobs during the week, mostly roadworks and scaffolding gigs that left my body aching by the weekend. I was also going through a rough patch with my girlfriend back then, and I guess I was trying to clear my head in the worst possible way. I'd always been drawn to weird places, especially ones no one wanted to go to, not because I was trying to be edgy or tough, but because quiet, forgotten places made me feel more grounded than any beach or bar ever could. I first found out about the graveyard from a coworker named Pat, who told me there was an abandoned burial ground behind an old Protestant church about 30 minutes west of the city center. It was supposedly shut down after World War II and hadn't been maintained since. The church still stood, or what was left of it. A moss-covered brick skeleton, mostly collapsed, fenced off and half swallowed by weeds. The graveyard behind it had maybe 40 or 50 headstones, most leaning sideways, many unreadable. No lights, no cameras, no real access unless you knew how to get in through the woods behind the motorway. That part made it perfect for me. I wanted silence and solitude, not a campsite with families and RVs. I wasn't out to drink or mess around. I just wanted to be away from everything and everyone for a couple of days. I packed light, just a small green tent, a roll mat, a gas burner, a few tins of beans and soup, water, a small lantern, a folding knife, and my old thermal sleeping bag. I had my phone, but I planned to keep it off most of the time. The walk there took nearly an hour and a half, partly down footpaths and then through some thin woodland. The trees were mostly bare, just beginning to bloom again after the winter. The graveyard itself was smaller than I expected. A rusted iron fence circled it, parts bent and pulled open, like deer or people had been through. The church was worse off than I imagined. No roof, most of the interior choked with nettles and rubble. But it was quiet, dead quiet. I picked a flat spot in the far corner of the graveyard, behind a cluster of crumbling stones that dated back to the 1800s. I cleared away twigs and set up my tent under a leafless yew tree. I remember standing there for a moment after it was all done, just looking around at the gray stones and the sinking light. There wasn't a single sound except the wind brushing the grass and the distant rush of cars from the motorway. I liked that. It made me feel small, but safe. Like I was buried in the middle of nowhere even though civilization was only a mile away. The first night was uneventful, cold but manageable. I heated some soup, wrote a bit in a small notebook I'd brought, and then laid back inside my tent, watching the flickering lantern cast shadows across the green nylon walls. I dozed off sometime after midnight, waking once to pee, then falling right back asleep. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, I noticed something weird on the grass near the base of one of the larger headstones about 20 feet from me. It looked like scratch marks, not claw marks or anything animal-like. These were deliberate, a straight line maybe a foot long, and two shorter diagonal ones crossing it like a crude symbol. They weren't deep, just etched shallow into the dirt and grass. I crouched down, stared at them for a minute, then looked around. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I figured maybe some edgy teenager had carved it before I got there. Or maybe I didn't notice it the night before. Either way, I brushed it off and went on with my day. That afternoon I wandered around the area a bit. I followed a small footpath deeper into the woods behind the church and found the remains of a dry stone wall and what might have been an old tool shed or storage building. Nothing exciting. I boiled some beans later and sat eating them while looking out at the crooked gravestones, most now buried deep in weeds and dead leaves. A few had cracked in half, others leaned so far they nearly touched the ground. I noticed again how quiet it was. No birds. No animals, not even insects buzzing around me. That silence started to feel heavier the longer I stayed there, like the air itself had weight, like something was watching even though nothing was there. That second night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a rustling sound outside my tent. Not wind, not rain. Movement. Sharp, definite steps over dry leaves. I stayed still, not wanting to make a sound. The steps didn't last long, maybe 5 seconds at most. Then silence. My heart was beating in my throat, but I didn't move. I stayed frozen for almost half an hour, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, I grabbed the knife and unzipped the tent just a few inches. I poked my head out slowly. There was no one there. Nothing moved. The sky was clouded, and my lantern was off. I didn't hear anything else that night. But when morning came and I stepped out, I found another mark on the ground, a few feet from the first one. Same shape, same strange angle, same size. This one was fresher. The grass was pulled up where it had been etched, and the dirt was still loose. Someone or something had done it during the night, no question about it. It hadn't been there before. I stood there for a long time, staring at the symbol. Then I looked up and realized I could see faint footprints in the morning dew. They circled around my tent, careful, light steps, and they didn't belong to me. My boots left heavier, wider prints. These were thinner, smaller, like a barefoot person walking slow. They disappeared near the edge of the woods, where the grass got patchier. I followed them a few feet before they faded completely. At that point, I started packing. I wasn't about to wait around for whoever was sneaking up on me in the middle of the night. I still didn't think it was anything supernatural. I figured maybe some local guy who didn't like people camping there, or a homeless person who stayed out in the woods and wanted to scare me off. But I wasn't going to take chances. I packed everything except the tent, rolled it all up in my backpack, and started walking toward the trail. That's when I saw the third mark. This one was on a stone itself, carved right into it. The same strange pattern, long line, short diagonal crosses. Not fresh, but recent enough that the white scratch marks were bright against the dark, weathered stone. This wasn't some accident. Whoever was doing this was marking the place for a reason. Or marking me. I changed course. Instead of going back the way I came, I decided to go through the woods past the back fence and circle toward the road on the other side. I knew it was longer, but it felt safer to avoid the trail. I moved quickly, trying not to make noise, glancing behind me every few seconds. The woods felt tighter now, like the trees were leaning in closer than before. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a trunk, but no one did. It took me over an hour to get to the road. I finally reached a small pull-off area where a gravel path met the asphalt. I sat there on a large flat rock, completely drained. My heart was still racing, my throat dry. I drank almost all of my water in one go. Then I just sat there and waited for a passing car. One finally came, and I managed to hitch a ride back into town from a delivery guy heading east. I never went back for the tent. I didn't even report it. What would I say? That someone drew a few lines in the grass and crept around my camp at night? I sounded like a paranoid idiot even in my own head. But the thing is, a week later, I found something that made my stomach drop. I was scrolling through local news on my laptop and came across a short article about a missing man. 42 years old. Last seen near the same area I camped. The date? 2 days after I left. The photo was grainy, but I recognized the background in one of the shots. The old church. Police had found his car pulled off the road a mile down from the trail I used. No sign of struggle. No sign of the man. Still missing to this day. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he saw something? Or someone? What if he stayed a night too long? I never told anyone about what happened. Not even my girlfriend at the time. We broke up a few months later anyway. Life moved on, jobs came and went. But I still think about that place sometimes. Not in a haunted, cursed kind of way. More like a warning. There are places that feel abandoned for a reason. Places people don't visit anymore because something pushed them out. Whatever was marking that graveyard wasn't trying to hurt me. Not right away. It was watching. It was getting closer. Maybe it just wanted to see how long I'd stay, how far I'd go before I left on my own. I think I passed the test. I think that other guy didn't. I'll never camp alone again. Not in a graveyard. Not anywhere. And I'll never ignore signs like that again. Because I know what I saw. And I know what I felt. And that graveyard? It wasn't empty. It was waiting. And I got out just in time. My name's Dave Kinsey. I was 32 when this happened. It was late October 2013. I had just quit my job in Columbus, Ohio after nearly a decade working the same warehouse shift every night from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. I didn't even give them 2 weeks' notice. I just stopped showing up one Monday and told myself I was done with the constant motion, the low pay, the aching joints, and the fluorescent lights humming above my head for 10 hours straight. I was done. The idea was to go camping alone for a week or so. Nothing fancy, just a back-to-basics kind of thing. No tent parks.
No RV campgrounds.
Just the woods. Me, a fire, and some time to think about where I'd go next. I decided to drive west through Indiana and into Illinois. Somewhere rural, flat, cold, empty. The kind of place no one really bothers with anymore. I had an old green Chevy Silverado that I bought used a few years earlier, and it still ran strong, even with 170,000 miles. I packed the bed with a foam mattress, an old army-style sleeping bag, a few blankets, water jugs, a propane burner, and a cooler full of canned food and eggs. I had my .22 rifle with me too, mostly for target shooting or small game if I needed it. I wasn't looking for danger. I just wanted space. The spot I picked wasn't a park. It was a patch of land I found through a few camping forums. Someone had posted GPS coordinates a couple years back saying it was a good spot to be alone, about 40 miles outside of Galesburg, Illinois, right near the Spoon River. You had to take a few unmarked gravel roads to get there, and it wasn't maintained or anything. Just raw, wooded country that hadn't been developed. The drive out there felt peaceful at first. Fall leaves were dry and red and blowing across the roads. The sky was pale and empty. I passed maybe 2 cars after leaving the highway, both pickups, both headed the other direction. I stopped once at an old gas station, one of those places that still had analog pumps and a single flickering light overhead, and filled the tank and my coffee thermos. The man inside barely looked up from his newspaper when I paid. It was already late afternoon when I made the turn onto the first dirt road. From there, it got quiet. No more houses, no more mailboxes, just trees. My tires kicked up dust that hovered in the air long after I passed through it. The road narrowed until my side mirrors were brushing against low branches. Every once in a while, I saw old fence posts that had long since fallen or been overtaken by weeds. I figured this was probably farmland back in the 60s or 70s, before people started leaving for cities. The coordinates led me to a small clearing near a bend in the river. There were signs that someone had been there before. An old fire ring made of blackened stones, some rusted out cans in the weeds, and a log someone had dragged over as a makeshift seat. But nothing recent. Felt forgotten. I parked the truck just off the clearing and set up camp. Laid the mattress in the bed, cracked open the cooler, and ate cold beans with white bread. I boiled water over the burner for tea and sat on the tailgate while it cooled, just watching the woods around me turn to shadow. That first night was uneventful. It got cold, fast. I climbed into the bed under 3 layers of blankets and tried to get comfortable. I was half awake most of the night, listening to branches snap and leaves move outside. You hear everything when you're alone like that. Owls, raccoons, maybe deer. I tried not to think about how far I was from help if anything went wrong. In the morning, I walked the area. The woods were thick and damp. The river was shallow and brown, with tree roots curling over the banks like veins. I followed a faint trail upriver for a while until it disappeared into mud. Found an old tire half buried in the brush, like someone had tried dumping trash out there years ago. Saw no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing recent. I stayed out there 3 days. The second day I heard something at night. Not animals, not the wind, something else. Heavy steps, not running, not quick, just slow and deliberate. Far off but getting closer. I sat up in the truck bed and listened. The sound stopped. Dead silence. Not even bugs. I waited, listened harder. Nothing. In the morning, I checked around camp. Didn't see anything out of place. No tracks. But the ground was mostly dry leaves, so I wouldn't have expected prints anyway. That day, I didn't go far from camp. I felt watched. I kept thinking I saw someone between the trees. Not clearly, just shapes. Glimpses. Could have been nothing. Could have been light shifting. Could have been someone. The third night was when I made my decision to leave early. I was lying in the bed again, fully awake, blankets pulled up to my chin. The moon was bright enough that I could see through the truck's back window. I saw movement, just a flicker of something. Then I heard a noise, a scraping sound, long and slow, like metal against bark. I sat up and looked through the rear window. Nothing. I grabbed my rifle and climbed out. The air was sharp and cold. I scanned the woods every direction, slowly. Didn't see a thing, but I didn't feel alone. Then I noticed something near the edge of the clearing, a tree that looked off. I walked over, rifle low but ready. When I got there, I saw a mark on the trunk, a fresh cut, clean, long, as if someone had taken a blade or some kind of metal edge and carved a diagonal line into the bark. It was deep, too deep to be done casually. It hadn't been there the day before. That was enough for me. I doused the fire, packed everything in silence, and got behind the wheel. The truck started fine, and I backed out of the clearing slowly, headlights cutting through the trees like knives. I drove back the way I came, the dirt road barely visible in the dark. About 15 minutes out, I came to a split in the path I didn't recognize. I hadn't seen it on the way in. There were no road signs, no markings. Just one road continuing forward, the other curving to the left. I was almost sure I'd come straight in, but I couldn't be sure. I hadn't marked anything. I hadn't taken pictures. I hadn't left any sort of trail. I stayed still for a moment, engine idling, trying to remember. Then I saw it. Far back in the trees, maybe 20 feet off the left fork. Something moved. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't on all fours. It stood upright, just past the reach of my headlights. Not moving fast, but still. Watching. Couldn't see a face. I couldn't even see details, but I knew it was a person. I turned the wheel slowly and took the road straight ahead. I kept my speed steady. I didn't stop again. It took me nearly 2 hours to find my way back to the highway. I had to backtrack twice, turn around in narrow clearings, and once I got stuck briefly in a shallow ditch. But I made it. I slept in a Walmart parking lot that night with the doors locked. When I got back to Columbus, I checked the forums again. Tried to find the post where someone had recommended that camping spot. Couldn't find it. I searched the GPS coordinates. Nothing came up. Not even on old message boards or map archives. I tried contacting the admin of one of the forums. Never heard back. Over the next few weeks, I kept wondering what I saw that night. I know it was a person. That part I'm sure of. The movement was too human. The posture, the stillness. They weren't surprised I was there. They were waiting, watching. The fresh cut in the tree, the footsteps, the silent nights. I think about it every time I see a clearing now. Every time I pass a patch of woods on the side of the road. There are places people forget about, places they stop visiting, places not on maps anymore. But that doesn't mean no one's there. Sometimes I wonder if I was the one intruding, and sometimes I wonder if they let me leave. It was late October 2013. I was 42 back then. I'd taken a week off from work, not for a vacation or to travel, but just to get away from the noise and people. My plan was simple: drive up from my home in Duluth to a patch of land near the Canadian border where my uncle used to take me deer hunting when I was a kid. I hadn't been back in years, not since he passed. It wasn't public land, exactly, but it also wasn't clearly owned or fenced off. Back in the 90s, no one cared if you walked a few miles off the back roads and set up a tree stand for a weekend. That area had always felt far enough from everything that I figured it would still be quiet. That's what I wanted, quiet. Just the woods, a tent, my rifle, and the cold. I packed light: tent, tarp, sleeping bag, Coleman stove, a few canned meals, water jugs, a camp axe, 2 boxes of .30-06, and my Remington. I also brought my trail cam, even though I wasn't sure I'd bother setting it up. My Chevy Silverado handled the gravel roads like nothing, even when they narrowed into little more than packed mud. When I finally parked the truck, the sun was getting low behind the pines, casting that golden orange light through the branches. That time of year, it gets cold fast once the light fades. I hiked in just over a mile from where I parked, going off the old deer paths I remembered from my uncle's time. Everything had changed and nothing had. Some of the big landmarks were still there: an old rusted bathtub near a creek, an overgrown logging road, but the smaller paths had been swallowed by years of growth. I picked a flat area near the bottom of a small ridge to set up camp, where I could see across a patch of low brush that deer often moved through around dawn. Good spot: dry ground, some natural cover, and enough open space for a clear shot if anything passed through. I got the tent up before the sun fully disappeared. The first night was uneventful, which is how I like it. The wind moved through the trees like water. I didn't bother with a fire, just heated up some chili on the stove and listened to the woods settle into night. I slept early, wore thick layers in my bag, and had no trouble getting comfortable. The next morning, I was up before the light. I climbed into a spot between 2 fir trees overlooking the clearing. No deer showed up. I wasn't too surprised. It had only been one day. I stayed still until just after 10, then wandered a bit to scout some trails and check for prints. That's when I noticed something that threw me off. There were boot prints. Not mine. Not fresh either, but newer than anything I would have expected this far out. They looked about average size, maybe a 10 or 11. The heel of one was worn down a bit more than the other. Someone had walked through here recently. The tracks came up from the south, maybe from deeper down the ridge, then veered off into thicker brush. I figured it was just another hunter, maybe someone with a cabin nearby. Still, it didn't sit right, not because of what they were, but because of where they were. Too far from any trail, too out of the way.
No flagging tape.
No signs of a stand, just boots, out in the open, like someone had wandered aimlessly. I followed the tracks for about 20 minutes. They twisted through some downed trees and eventually stopped near a dry creek bed. Just stopped. No return tracks, no camp, no clear destination. I stood there for a while, staring at the last print. Something about the way it ended felt off, like they hadn't stopped naturally, like they were dragged or had disappeared. I didn't have proof of that. I just didn't like the feeling I had. I went back to camp, ate some cold beans, and took a short nap. That afternoon, I tried hunting again. Still nothing. The woods were too quiet.
No squirrels. No birds.
Just wind. Sometimes, I thought I heard something moving behind me, off in the distance, but when I turned, it was nothing. Could have been nerves. Could have been deer moving quiet. But the unease stuck with me through the second night. That night, I kept my rifle inside the tent, just in case. The cold came down hard. I kept waking up from the wind pressing against the tent walls, making them ripple and crack. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. Not footsteps, just the sound of something brushing against the nylon of the tent. Slow, sliding. I didn't move at first. I listened. My ears felt like they were pushing out of my head, straining to catch anything. But the sound stopped. Dead silence followed. Then something snapped. A stick or branch maybe 30 feet away. Not an animal. Too heavy. Then silence again. I waited for a full hour before I dared unzip the tent and look. Nothing. The trees were still. The clearing untouched. In the morning, I found the footprints. They circled my tent. Full circle.
Footprints.
Same as before. One heel more worn than the other. The prints had come from the woods behind me, moved around the tent, then headed off again toward the east. Still no sign of a return trail. I packed up my gear that morning and carried it up to a new campsite about half a mile further north. A higher ridge, better view. I didn't like being watched. That's how it felt. Like someone had stood outside my tent in the dark, just watching. I didn't make a fire again that night. Didn't cook anything either. Just laid in my bag, wide awake, rifle in my hands. That night, the wind didn't blow. It was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your skin. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just outside. It was farther away, maybe 100 feet. A dragging sound, then a short grunt, like someone clearing their throat or trying to lift something heavy. Then silence. The next morning, I went looking again. I walked toward where I thought the sounds came from. It was a shallow grove, mostly moss and pine. I found another trail of footprints, the same boots. This time, I followed them further. I moved slow, scanning the ground. After about 300 yards, I found something half buried in the dirt. A small camp shovel, metal, worn, but not rusted. Next to it was an old wool glove, torn, and nearby, a mound of earth that looked too fresh. I don't know why I did it. I shouldn't have, but I started to dig, just with my hands. The soil was soft, maybe 2 feet down. I found something wrapped in a brown tarp. I pulled it back, and what I saw made me stumble backward. It was a deer, or what was left of one, mostly bones, but the head was still intact, cleaned, not eaten. No guts, no blood, just the head and some ribs. Someone had placed it there like it meant something, buried it neatly like a ritual, covered it back up, hands shaking. I felt cold all over. It wasn't just the deer. It was the feeling that someone had wanted it to be found, like a message. I backed away from the grove, watching the trees the whole time. I felt like I wasn't alone out there. That afternoon, I packed everything up. I was done. I knew I wouldn't sleep again, and I didn't want to find out what else was buried out there. I started hiking back toward where I parked. Took a different route just in case I was being followed. When I reached the truck, I felt some relief, but not much. As I loaded my gear, I noticed something on the driver's side door. A handprint, smudged in dirt. Human, right on the window, like someone had leaned close to look inside. I hadn't seen it that morning when I left. It hadn't rained or snowed. That meant someone had been near my truck while I was camped out. I drove straight back to Duluth, checking the rearview mirror every couple minutes. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? Someone buried a deer in the woods and watched me sleep? No one would care. No one would believe it was a threat. But I know what I felt. Someone was out there. Not a hunter. Not a hiker. Someone who didn't want company. Who moved through the woods with no flashlight and circled tents at night. Someone who left clean bones under fresh dirt. Someone who wore worn-out boots and didn't make a sound. I never went back. I still hunt, but not up there. Not even close. That part of Minnesota feels wrong to me now, like something hollowed it out. Every so often, I check forums online to see if anyone else has talked about that area. Sometimes I see vague posts, talk of weird prints, strange sounds, but never anything detailed. No one wants to say what they saw. Maybe they think it was just their imagination. I don't. I still think about that print on my truck window. How long they must have stood there. How long they must have watched me through the trees before making that slow, silent circle around my tent. Not saying a word, not taking anything, just watching. And I still wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't moved camp that day? What would have happened if I'd stayed put another night? I don't think I would have liked the answer. It was 2014, early September, when I drove out to Utah with my cousin Daniel. I was 26 that year, still doing part-time jobs here and there, just trying to get my head straight. Daniel was the same age. He'd been a forest tech for a while and knew a lot about backcountry hiking, maps, water filtration, all that stuff. We weren't super close growing up, but we'd reconnected after a family gathering a few months before. I mentioned I wanted to do a real camping trip, something without tents right next to the truck, and he said he knew a perfect place near the Uinta Mountains. He said it wasn't a tourist spot. No signs, no trails on Google Maps, just a long logging road and a 4-mile hike in. You had to know where to go. That sounded perfect to me. I needed to get away. Life in Arizona had felt heavy for a while. I don't even know what was weighing on me exactly. It just felt like I needed to breathe somewhere where no one else was around. We packed light but smart. Sleeping bags, tarps, fire starter, headlamps, a portable water filter, a hatchet, bear spray, basic med kit, enough food for a few days. No cell signal out there, of course. But Daniel brought a handheld GPS unit. He liked to mark the location of camp and any water sources we found. The drive from Salt Lake to the dirt road entrance was long, especially since the road got rough as hell the last 10 miles. We had to get out and move some branches and rocks a couple times. I remember it being just past 4 p.m. when we parked the truck on a rocky shoulder off that logging road. There weren't any signs, not even a Forest Service tag, just endless pine trees on either side and a bit of sun left in the sky. Daniel looked at the sky and said we had about 2.5 hours before it got too dark to hike. That made sense. The sun dipped earlier up there. We loaded our packs and set out. The trail wasn't even a trail. It was just the direction Daniel said he'd taken before. A subtle game trail that cut between some fallen logs and led into thicker woods. Felt like we were walking into a place no one had touched in years. About a mile in, everything got quieter. I noticed that the bugs stopped buzzing. The breeze that moved the tops of the trees didn't seem to make it down to the ground anymore. It wasn't dead silent, but there was something muffled about it, like a blanket over the whole forest. By the time we reached the clearing Daniel wanted to camp in, my legs were tired and my back was starting to ache from the pack. The clearing was small, maybe 20 feet wide, surrounded by pines and underbrush so dense it felt like a wall. There was a flat area near a fire ring that looked old but used. Black char in the middle, old rocks in a ring, some half-burned sticks. We unpacked, laid our tarps, and set up our sleeping bags. Daniel said we'd skip a fire the first night and keep things quiet. He was a little paranoid about being seen. Said that place was near reservation land, and he wasn't 100% sure we weren't already over the invisible line. I didn't argue. I was tired, and honestly, the idea of being out there with zero noise and no light made it feel more real. We ate in silence. Canned beans, jerky, a little bread, drank from our bottles. When we laid down, I expected to be wide awake, but I passed out fast. The kind of sleep that's deeper than anything I ever got at home. The first night was fine. It was the second day when things started to feel off. We spent that day walking around the woods, gathering deadfall for a fire later that night, and checking out the ridge to the west. Daniel said he remembered a small stream near there last time. We found it, marked it on the GPS, and filled our bottles. There were tracks in the soft mud nearby, mostly deer, but one set that looked strange. Daniel crouched near it and frowned. The track was long and narrow, like a bare human foot but thinner. Longer toes.
Nos chutred.
It was deep, meaning it came from something heavier than a deer. But it was alone. No matching prints beside it. Just one, like something had stepped into the mud and disappeared. Daniel rubbed his chin and looked around. Then he stood up and shrugged. Could be someone messing around barefoot, or something limping. That's all he said about it. I remember him seeming more watchful after that. That night we had a fire. It wasn't huge, but enough to cook some sausages we'd brought in foil. We sat on logs and ate quietly, watching the fire crackle. The darkness around us felt like it pressed in. There was no moon that night, and the trees were so thick the stars barely made it through. Sometime after we put the fire out and laid in our bags, I woke up. I don't know why. No sound. No movement. I just opened my eyes and felt like something was wrong. The tarp above me moved slightly, like a breeze passed under it, but I didn't feel any air on my skin. I rolled onto my side and glanced toward Daniel's bag. He wasn't there. I sat up. His sleeping bag was empty, but zipped open like he'd gotten up carefully. I waited, listening.
No footsteps. No noise.
Just that dense silence again. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard what sounded like light steps out in the trees, past the edge of the clearing. I stayed still, thinking he'd just gone to relieve himself or something, but he didn't come back. I laid back down eventually, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not close, just far enough that it felt intentional. Like someone wanted me to hear them but not see them. It was steady, calm, deep. I stayed frozen. It went on for a full minute. Then it stopped. In the morning, Daniel was back, sitting near the cold fire ring with his pack half-zipped. He looked pale, more tired than I'd seen him. I asked if he'd gone somewhere. He just shook his head and said he had trouble sleeping. We ate in silence. The third day, I noticed more strange things. There were small stacks of rocks near the edge of the clearing that hadn't been there before. 5 or 6 stones carefully balanced. Too carefully. I pointed them out to Daniel and he said he hadn't made them. Then we found something worse. A rabbit carcass, stripped of skin, lying clean in the grass about 30 feet from camp. Not torn apart, not eaten, just skinned, almost surgical. The meat was untouched. No blood trail, no bones broken, just placed there. Daniel took a long look at it and said we should move camp farther up the ridge tomorrow. He didn't want to sleep in that clearing again. That night, he agreed we shouldn't have a fire. We both laid in our bags early, not saying much. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I woke again. Same feeling, something wrong. This time I didn't move. I kept my eyes barely open and tried to breathe slow and quiet. I heard soft steps again. Not far, right at the edge of the clearing. Then I heard a voice. Said my name. Not shouted, not whispered, just said it. Calmly, plainly, like someone trying to get me to answer. But Daniel was in his bag next to me. I could see the rise and fall of his breathing. Then it said his name. Exactly the same tone. Calm, flat.
No urgency.
Just stating it. I didn't move. I stayed that way until light broke through the trees. In the morning, the rabbit carcass was gone. So were the rock piles. Daniel looked shaken, and I didn't need to ask if he'd heard it too. He just said we were leaving. We hiked out fast. We didn't eat. We didn't talk. Just packed everything in 20 minutes and moved. The hike back felt longer, like the forest had changed. I noticed that we were being followed. I didn't see anything, but I kept hearing twigs snap behind us, just once every few minutes, enough to make my stomach tighten. Daniel noticed too. He kept looking over his shoulder. About halfway back to the truck, we found something hanging from a tree. It was a shirt, Daniel's shirt, one he'd packed but hadn't worn yet, folded neatly and tied to a branch with grass. That did it. We started running. We didn't stop until we saw the truck. It looked untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling something had watched us the whole way. When we slammed the doors and locked them, Daniel finally spoke. He said, "That wasn't a person." I didn't answer. We drove in silence until we reached the main road. I haven't been back to Utah since. Daniel quit his forestry job a few months later, moved to Oregon. He doesn't talk about that trip. I still don't know what it was that called our names, or how it had Daniel's shirt, or how it skinned that rabbit without making a sound. I just know one thing with complete certainty. Something in those woods was pretending to be my cousin, and I don't think it wanted to hurt us. I think it wanted to be us. That's worse. We left before it got the chance. But I think if we'd stayed one more night, I might not have been the one walking out of those woods. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip down in Arkansas. It was October of 2021, and I had just finished working a non-stop 3-month contract job in Kansas City. I'd been staring at a screen for so many hours every day that my eyes started to ache just from daylight. I needed to get out. I didn't want people around me, didn't want bars, noise, or traffic. I just wanted some time alone in the woods. I picked a spot in the Ouachita National Forest near a lesser-known trail called Albert's Bluff. Most people went toward the more popular trails on the western side, but I found a little loop off the beaten path on an old topo map online. There were no campgrounds in that area, no toilets, no signs, just forest and silence. I loaded my gear into the back of my 2004 Silverado: tent, sleeping bag, 2 knives, a small hatchet, portable stove, water bladder, dehydrated food, tarp, first aid, and my .38 snub revolver. I didn't normally carry a gun camping, but I was going to be 15 miles from anything. No cell service, and I figured if not for protection, at least it might give me peace of mind. The drive took me nearly 6 hours, including a detour through broken gravel roads deep into the forest. I passed one old general store with faded gas pumps and then nothing else. Just trees and more trees. By the time I reached the clearing I'd marked on my map, it was late afternoon. The spot was beautiful, with tall oaks and maples showing the full range of orange and red. It was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No distant car sounds, no hums or voices, just the breeze through the leaves and the occasional creak of an old tree. I set up camp off to the side of the trail, if you could even call it a trail. It was more like a barely there deer path. I pitched the tent under a cluster of oaks, laid out the tarp for firewood, and gathered some stones to circle the fire pit. Everything was peaceful. I ate a quick meal, made some weak instant coffee, and watched the sunset through the branches. That first night went smooth, cold but manageable. The forest was quiet. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to take a leak and heard some faint rustling far off, but I chalked it up to deer or raccoons. The next day, I hiked a wide loop that took me about 10 miles round trip. I saw no one. No tents, no trash, no footprints, nothing. It was what I wanted, total solitude. The woods were gorgeous. At one point, I sat on a large boulder overlooking a shallow valley and just breathed, listening to birdsong and the occasional snapping twig. When I got back to camp around 4 p.m., something felt just a little off. Nothing was missing, and nothing looked disturbed. But the air felt different, heavier almost. The breeze had died down, and the trees were still. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion. I made another meal, stacked some more firewood, and settled in with a small fire. But I noticed myself checking the woods more often than before. My ears seemed sharper. Every small sound in the distance felt like it had weight behind it. Around 8 p.m., I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a stick breaking, close, maybe 30 yards behind my tent. That alone wasn't unusual. Could have been an armadillo or raccoon. But what got to me was the pattern. I waited and heard it again. Another slow snap, then a pause, then again. It wasn't a single animal rooting through leaves. It was footsteps, spaced apart just enough to sound deliberate, like someone walking barefoot, carefully, through the woods. I killed the fire quickly and stepped into the darkness with my flashlight. I pointed it toward the trees behind my tent, but the beam only cut about 40 feet into the underbrush. Nothing. I stood still and listened. The woods were silent again. Not even wind.
No frogs, no crickets.
Nothing. I stayed there for a few minutes, then circled the tent slowly, flashlight up, hand near my revolver. Still nothing. No movement. No sound. Eventually, I told myself it must have been a deer. Maybe it stepped on a dry branch and wandered off. I got into the tent and zipped it shut, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening, holding the flashlight in one hand and the revolver in the other. Every few minutes I swore I heard a faint shift of leaves. Once it sounded like breathing. I kept telling myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. I didn't sleep well, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I decided I'd cut my trip short. Something about the place had started to feel wrong. It wasn't that anything had happened exactly, just a thick tension that built up and didn't go away. I started packing around 7 a.m. Then I noticed something that stopped me cold. On a tree about 20 feet behind my tent, there were fresh scrape marks in the bark. Deep and vertical, about 6 of them, spaced like fingers. They were long, jagged, and fresh, so fresh the inner wood was still pale and moist. And they were high up, almost 6 feet off the ground. No bear made those. Not in Arkansas, and not that clean. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I didn't touch them. I didn't take a photo. I just stood there with a knot forming in my chest. I finished packing fast, tossed everything in the truck. I didn't eat. Didn't even grab a final coffee. I just drove, slow over the rocks and dips, until I reached the gravel road again. But it wasn't over. About 4 miles down the road, where the gravel narrowed and twisted along a ridge, I saw something I'll never forget. There was a man standing still, off to the left of the road. Not walking, not waving, just standing. He wore a dark hoodie and tan pants, hands at his sides. His clothes were dusty and stained like he'd been living outside for weeks. His face was in shadow under the hood. He didn't move, not even a step, as my truck passed him. There was no vehicle,
No bike.
nothing near him, just woods. I kept driving. My hands gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me in one piece. I looked in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved. He just stood there watching. I didn't stop driving until I hit the state highway. I didn't check maps, didn't stop for gas, didn't even stop for food. I just drove straight back to Kansas City and didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. When I finally told my brother, who hikes more than I do, he told me something that still sticks with me. He said the area I went to was sometimes used by squatters. People who lived totally off-grid, sometimes with criminal records. Sometimes just mentally ill, sometimes worse. They stay hidden. They know the woods better than any hiker. And they don't like company. That scrape on the tree, that was probably a message. A warning, maybe, a claim. And the man, he was probably watching me the whole time. Maybe from the second night, maybe longer. I still think about it now and then. How long was I being watched? Was someone creeping closer while I slept? What if I'd stayed another night? What if I hadn't packed up when I did? I don't camp alone anymore, and I'll never go back to Arkansas. Not to that part. Not ever. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a short camping trip out in the hills near Greenvale, a small town in North Yorkshire. I had just turned 34 and was working long hours as a warehouse supervisor in Leeds. My back hurt all the time and I rarely got a moment to myself. The plan was simple, just one weekend, alone under the stars. No emails, no noise, no one asking me for anything. I didn't even bring a tent, just my bivy bag, a roll mat, and a few basic supplies. I had camped alone before, always somewhere quiet, never at proper campsites. This time I wanted somewhere even more remote. After browsing a few maps online, I noticed a disused quarry on a hill about 4 miles outside Greenvale. It wasn't marked as dangerous, just labeled old slate workings. The satellite view showed a flat area on the western edge, surrounded by thin woodland. It looked perfect. I parked my car on a levee just off a farm road, about 1.5 miles from the quarry, and walked in. The route took me through a sheep field, a damp boggy patch that soaked my socks, and then a long sloping hill with the odd patch of wild bramble and young birch trees. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sky sits dull and white but never rains. I had my small backpack, a bottle of water, a dry bag with my food and sleeping kit, and a fixed blade knife strapped inside my pack. More for whittling sticks than anything else. When I reached the quarry, it was almost 6 in the evening. It had an eerie feel, I'll admit that straight away. The flat part I'd seen on the map was clearly man-made. Broken stone and gravel covered the ground, and in places, dark gray shale peeked through. Beyond it, the land dropped steeply into a large, uneven pit. It wasn't just one clean drop. It dipped in awkward stages, jagged and unstable. Water had pooled in the bottom, stale and greenish. Dead branches floated in it, along with a collapsed sign that probably once warned people to keep out. Despite the odd atmosphere, I felt good. Alone. Quiet. I set up my bivvy near the tree-line at the edge of the flat ground, just far enough from the pit. From there, I had a view west across a dip in the hills, with farmland in the distance and faint shapes of buildings too far to hear or worry about. I boiled water on my little gas stove and ate a pack of instant noodles. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves. There weren't any birds, not really, just the occasional crow in the distance. I tried to read, but after a while I just lay back and watched the gray sky shift into a deeper, darker blue. It was around 9:30 when I first noticed something strange. There were no lights anywhere, obviously, but over the ridge on the far side of the quarry, past the deepest part of the pit, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox, but the way it moved didn't match. It wasn't quick or smooth. It was slow, steady. I thought it might be a hiker like me. But who the hell hikes into an abandoned quarry at this time of night? From the far side, there wasn't even a path over there. I sat up and watched, barely breathing. The shape disappeared behind a rise in the quarry wall, then reappeared slightly lower. It was a man, that much became clear. He moved oddly, slightly hunched, as if trying not to be seen, but not quite hiding either. He never looked my way. Or maybe he did, but I couldn't tell from that distance. He went down into the pit, then vanished behind a mound of rubble. I waited, 5 minutes, then 10. I didn't see him again. That should have been the point where I packed up and left. I didn't. I told myself maybe he was just someone else who liked camping off-grid. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he was just passing through. It wasn't my business. But I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing little sounds, not loud, not clear, just small crunches of stone or the occasional crack of a twig. But that quarry had strange acoustics. I told myself it was the echo of small animals or even my own movement. I finally dozed off sometime past midnight. When I woke, the light was low and gray. The sun wasn't up yet, but it was coming. Everything was wet with dew. I lay still for a long time, listening. Then I noticed something new. Footprints, about 30 feet from where I'd slept. In the gravelly dust near the quarry's edge, I saw the outline of boot prints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, narrower. Someone had walked toward my bivvy from the quarry pit, then turned around and gone back. I sat up slowly and scanned the area. Nothing. I didn't hear anyone, didn't see anything, but those prints were real, fresh. That's when I realized my food bag had been moved. It wasn't open, just dragged a few feet toward the trees. A corner of the dry bag was ripped, like someone had tugged at it. I still had all my gear, including my knife and stove. The prints circled it once before heading back to the quarry edge. That did it. I packed everything in record time and left. I didn't even stop for water. My heart was going the whole time. Every crack of a branch, every flutter of wind made me flinch. I didn't take the same way back. Instead of heading northwest toward the farm road and my car, I cut across the slope and aimed for a dirt track that ran parallel to a narrow woodland. The ground was uneven, and I twisted my ankle more than once. But I didn't care. I just wanted to put distance between me and that quarry. I kept going for over an hour, not stopping. Eventually, I found an old sheep gate and followed the fence line down toward a broader path. The track finally took me to a small car park used by dog walkers. When I reached my car again, I didn't feel safe yet. Only after I drove 10 miles out of Greenvale and reached a petrol station did I breathe properly. You'd think that would be the end of it, that I'd go home and forget about it. But the real fear came later. 2 days after I got home, I was scrolling through some local news pages out of boredom. On a tiny local blog run by someone in Greenvale, I saw a short post. Police have found the remains of a makeshift camp near the old slate quarry off Barden Edge. Locals reported strange sightings in recent weeks, and authorities have urged hikers to avoid the area. I kept reading. The camp wasn't mine. It had been deeper inside the pit. Tarp, fire pit, plastic bags, food wrappers, a rusted kitchen knife, and old clothes. But the scariest part? They found several small bones buried in the loose gravel. Animal bones, mostly, but not all of them. They didn't say human, but they didn't say they weren't either.
No arrests.
No names.
No answers.
Just an active warning to avoid the area. I've never camped alone again. Even now, 9 years later, I still think about those footprints. The way they came so close to my head while I slept. How easily it could have gone another way. How lucky I was to wake up at all. Whatever was living in that quarry wasn't just another camper. Someone had been watching me, and I wasn't supposed to see them. It was August of 2014 when I decided to go camping alone in Northumberland. I was 32 at the time and living in a small flat in York. Life had slowed down quite a bit. I had split up with my girlfriend a few months earlier, and most of my friends were either married or busy with jobs and kids. I needed a break from the city and wanted to clear my head somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could sit by a fire and not hear traffic or sirens or people shouting on a Saturday night. I had grown up with camping trips in the countryside, mostly in the Peak District or up in the Lake District, but I hadn't been out in the wild for nearly 10 years. It was something I'd been meaning to do again for ages, and now that I had no one waiting on me, I figured I'd just go for it. I didn't overthink it. I looked up some spots on a map and found an area that looked pretty remote near a forest just outside a small village called Elston in Northumberland National Park. Not too far from the Scottish border, actually. There was a dense patch of woodland, open fields, and a river running nearby. I picked a point on the map, packed up my old gear, bought a few new supplies, and headed out one Friday morning. I arrived around noon. The drive had been quiet. Once I got out of the town roads and into the countryside, it felt like I was going back in time. Old stone walls lined the edges of narrow roads. Sheep wandered freely across lanes, and the villages I passed through looked almost deserted. When I got to the rough track that led toward the woods, I parked up on the side of a grass verge, shouldered my bag, and started walking. It took me maybe 40 minutes to hike in deep enough to feel truly alone. I passed through a stretch of young pine trees, crossed a small stream by hopping across a few stones, and followed a deer trail up a gentle rise until I found a little clearing. It was just wide enough to pitch a tent and surrounded by trees on three sides. A perfect flat spot with soft moss underfoot and no sign of anyone having been there. It was quiet, not silent, but the kind of quiet that only comes from nature. Whined through the trees, distant bird calls, and the occasional rustle of something small in the undergrowth. I pitched my tent, got the fire pit ready, and boiled some water for a cup of tea. The phone signal was gone, which I was fine with. I had everything I needed: stove, food, water, torch, knife, and a couple of books. For a few hours, I just sat back against a tree and stared at the canopy above me, letting my mind drift. I felt good, like I had stepped out of everything that had been weighing me down. Around dusk, the air cooled quickly, and I got the fire going with some twigs and dry wood I'd gathered. The smoke curled slowly upward, and the flames crackled softly. I ate some instant noodles and a flapjack, then just sat there with a hot mug between my hands, enjoying the solitude. That night, I went to bed early. The sleeping bag was warm, and the forest was dark but not too loud. I must have drifted off sometime around 10. I woke up at maybe 2 in the morning, not because of a noise or a nightmare. I just opened my eyes and realized I was wide awake. I lay there for a while listening. There was a light wind, but no rain. Just the trees creaking a little and a faint hoot of an owl somewhere far off. Then I heard it. A footstep. Just one. It was off to the left, maybe 10 feet from the tent. It wasn't an animal, it had weight to it. The dry layer of needles and leaves made it easy to tell when something stepped on them. My first thought was deer, maybe a badger, but it had sounded heavier than that. Still, I stayed still and waited, thinking it might move on. Another step, this time closer, then 2 more steps, slower, as if someone was trying to move quietly. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hand slowly reached down and found the handle of the knife I kept near my mat. The air inside the tent was suddenly very cold. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then nothing. No more steps.
No sounds.
Just silence again. I stayed still for what must have been 20 minutes, straining to hear anything. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a fox. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I was just jumpy. But I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there in the dark, clutching the knife, eyes fixed on the black ceiling of the tent, and waited for dawn. When light finally started to seep in through the canvas, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as before, calm. Nothing looked out of place. But when I walked around the tent, I saw it. A footprint. It wasn't mine. I was wearing hiking boots with a thick tread. This was a flat sole, almost like a dress shoe or work boot. The print was faint, but clear enough in the soft soil between the trees. Just one, facing the tent. No others nearby. I packed up quickly, but I didn't leave. That was the strange thing. I should have just hiked back to the car and driven home. But something kept me there. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was spooked. Maybe I didn't want to turn a peaceful trip into some weird paranoid memory. I decided I'd stay one more night, just to prove to myself it was all in my head. The second day was clear and warm. I hiked deeper into the woods and followed the river for a while. Caught a few photos on my camera. Watched a buzzard glide over the trees. It was a good day. I tried to forget about the footprint, tried to pretend it was something else. Maybe I had stepped there without realizing. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting. I made another fire, ate again, sat with my back to the trees and kept my torch close. I stayed up later this time, past midnight. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound that I couldn't explain. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent and zipped it tight, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing little sounds. Not footsteps this time, just soft cracks and snaps in the woods. Could have been anything, but they kept happening. Once every few minutes. Far off, then closer, then further again. Then something brushed the side of the tent. Just a light drag like a hand across the canvas. I held my breath. Then it was gone. I stayed frozen for maybe half an hour. Then, slowly, I unzipped the flap and stuck my head out. The fire had died down, and the clearing was dim. My torch beam swept across the trees. Nothing. I got out and walked the perimeter of the camp, checking the trees, the bushes. I felt watched, like someone was just out of sight, ducking behind a trunk or crouching in the brush. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't go away. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found something else. Another print, this time closer to the tent, and a small torn scrap of cloth caught on a low branch. It was dark green, looked like part of a coat. I packed up and left. The walk back to the car felt longer than before. Every little noise made me turn around. I kept checking over my shoulder. I was sure someone was following me, but I never saw anyone. I reached the car, tossed my pack in, and drove without stopping until I reached Morpeth. I sat in a cafe for an hour just to feel around people again. When I got home, I checked the photos I'd taken on the hike. I zoomed in on one of the river shots, and my stomach turned. In the far background, between two trees, was a shape. Almost invisible, but it was there. A figure standing in the shadow, facing the camera. Blurred by distance and trees. Could have been anything. A trick of the light, a branch, a shadow. But I knew it wasn't. A man had been out there, watching me. I didn't report it. What would I say? Someone stood near my camp and made me nervous? There was no crime.
No confrontación.
No injury. Just the heavy feeling that I'd been followed. I deleted the photo. I didn't want to see it again. 2 weeks later, I was back in York, starting to sleep properly again, trying to forget it. Then something else happened. Postcard arrived. No return address. No name. Just a photo of a forest. Not a tourist photo. It looked like someone had taken it with a cheap camera. On the back, in small writing, "Nice spot. I like it too." That was it. I never went camping alone again, and I never found out who had sent it. But I know this much. Someone was out in those woods, and they weren't there by accident.